Marxist Elegy, Althusser and the break in Marx. But enlightenment is and remains unsatisfied. The second major factor in its self-denial is its disappointment with Marxism. A large part of the present-day cynical twilight has its origin in the experiences of what became of orthodox Marxist movements, in Leninism, Stalinism, with the Viet Cong in Cuba, and in the Khmer Rouge. In Marxism we experience the collapse of what promised to become the rational other. It was the development of Marxism that drove a wedge between enlightenment and the principle of being left-wing, and that wedge can never be taken out. The degeneration of Marxism into the legitimating ideology of hidden nationalist and open hegemonic and despotic systems has ruined the much celebrated principle of hope and spoiled any pleasure in history, which is in any case difficult. The left too is learning that one can no longer speak of communism as if none existed, and as if one could ingenuously begin anew. I have hinted at the peculiar double structure of Marxian knowledge in the fourth unmasking. It is a composite of emancipative and reifying theory. Reification, Verdinglichung, is a feature of any knowledge that strives to dominate things. Dinge. In this sense, Marxian knowledge was a knowledge of domination from the start. Long before Marxism was in power anywhere, theoretically or practically, it already behaved tactically in a perfectly realist political style, as a hegemonic power even before it seized power. Marxism always dictated much too precisely the correct line. It has always hot-temperedly annihilated every practical alternative. It has always said to the consciousness of the masses, "I am your master and liberator, you shall have no other liberator before me. Every liberty you take upon yourself from elsewhere is a petty bourgeois deviation." In relation to other tendencies of enlightenment, Marxism also assumed the position that corresponds to that of a reflecting surface. The intellectual student cadre of Marxism behaved like the censorship departments of bourgeois ministries for the interior and for the police, which studied everything produced by non-Marxist enlighteners and censored that which gave even a hint of promoting non-conformism. Louis Althusser, earlier the theoretical head of the French Communist Party, created a disturbance more than a decade ago when he claimed to have found a scientific theoretical break in Marx's work, a transition from a humanist ideology to an anti-humanist structural science, which occurred between the early works and the works of maturity. This break, which Althusser, one of the best Marx experts of the present, had theoretically tracked down, seems to have been reincarnated in his own personality. In a way, he became sick because of what he saw. The break became his scientific, political, and existential locus. Because Althusser understood Marx sympathetically, the break in Marx's theory and existence impressed itself with an almost symbiotic depth on his theory and his life. One may venture to say that Althusser was wrecked by this conflict. For years, the contradiction between his philosophical competence and his loyalty to the Communist Party put a strain on his theoretical work as well as on his very existence. Married to a sociologist with Bolshevist convictions, the conflict between orthodoxy and insight, between loyalty and freedom, pursued him even into his private life. Althusser recognized that, in a certain regard, Marx was no longer Marx, and that a break, an ambiguity, runs through his work that again and again makes its theoretical and practical validity problematic. In his loyalty to the truth and to the Communist Party, Althusser could no longer remain Althusser. Thus, the world-famous Marxist philosopher, in a psychotic attack of mental confusion, as they say, murdered his wife on the 16th of November 1980, perhaps in one of those desperate states in which one no longer knows where the other begins and where the ego ends, where the boundaries between self-assertion and blind destruction dissolve. Who is the murderer? Is it Althusser, the philosopher, who killed himself through his wife? The dogmatist, in order to end the state of divided being that kept the philosopher from really living? Is it the murder of liberation by a prisoner who, as inner self-defence, killed what killed him? Is it a murder committed on Althusser, the famous man, who could destroy his own false identity, his own false fame, his false signification, only by plunging into the cynical sphere of criminality? As is known in psychology, there are suicides who are basically murderers of someone else, but there are also murderers who are basically suicides and that they annihilate themselves in the other. I will attempt to interpret the Althusserian break differently from the way in which he himself interpreted it. In doing so, I will pay attention to his example and the language of his act. I want to erect a monument to the philosopher by reconstructing his interpretation of Marx, the real break in Marx's theory. It is a monument for a murderer who, with confused violence, made visible a break that cannot be made to disappear by any act of will to mediate it, by any loyalty, or by any fear of separation. In the Marxian oeuvre there is a rupture, not between an ideological and a scientific phase, but between two modalities of reflection. A cynical, offensive, humanistic, emancipative reflection, and an objectivistic, master cynical reflection, which, deriding the striving for freedom of others in the style of a functionalist ideology critique. On the one hand, Marx is something of a rebel, on the other, something of a monarch. His left half resembles Danton, his right half is reminiscent of Bismarck. Like Hegel, who bore a similar double temperament of revolutionary and statesman within himself, Marx is one of the greatest dialectical thinkers, because in him a fruitful inner polemic between at least two sparring thinker souls was at work. Althusser's theoretical and existential tragedy starts after the so-called coupure epistemologique. Pardon my French. It is that realist political Marx to whom Althusser attributes an absolutely scientific real theory of capital, purified of all humanist sentimentalities. This is the sense of his structural reading. The work of the young Marx is rooted in his impressions of the Hegelian logic, with which he went into battle against Hegelian idealism itself. Labour and praxis are the key concepts with which one finds one's way out of the casing of the system in a Hegelian way. They hold the hope of a new type of scientific approach, an empiricism that does not fall back behind the summits of philosophical reflection. With these concepts of labour and praxis, which combine in the lofty concept of politics, the left Hegelian generation went beyond its master. From the spirit grew a powerful, pugnacious social critique that understood itself as real humanism, as a turning to the real human being. The genius of the young Marx is shown in his not remaining content with a turning from the Hegelian system to a post-Hegelian humanist critique. His sharpest polemic, therefore, was directed initially against his greatest temptation, which he shared with his generation of intelligentsia, namely to persist in mere critical critique. He sensed, and rationalised this perception, that a powerful critical theory must conquer the world of objects and reality itself in order to conceptualize them not only positively but also critically. This impulse was the reason, among other things, for his turning to political economy, which he took up in its naive bourgeois form in order to surpass it with a reflected theory. The insipid phrase learning process fails to capture the drama of this creative reflection. Marx's thinking travelled the path from the Hegelian system to the critique of political economy, from a contemplative conception of theory to an understanding of theory as world mover, from the sphere of ideas to the discovery of labour, from abstract to concrete anthropology, from the illusion of nature to the history of the self-creation of humanity. As theory of social emancipation, Marxian knowledge could secure recognition only if, at the same time, it named a mass ego that would recognise the possibility of its freedom in the mirror of this theory. Here Marx made himself into the historical logical teacher and patron of the proletariat, which he identified as the predestined pupil of his theory. Through the proletariat, he wanted to become the great liberator by intervening in the course of European history as the teacher of the workers' movement. Marx, however, stepped over dead bodies at least twice in a way that raises doubts as to his claim to teach and his realism. In Max Stirner and Bakunin, I see the most intimate opponents of Marx, because they were the theorists whom he could not simply surpass, but whom, in order to exclude them, he had to practically annihilate with his critique. For both represented clear, logical and objective alternatives to Marx's solutions. Stirner with his question whether and how one can break through private alienation, and Bakunin with his question whether and how a way can be found to a future alienation-free society. Marx criticised both outright with a practically eviscerative hatred. The famous posthumous German ideology, in large part directed against Stirner, contains the most intensive, detailed dispute Marx and Engels ever carried out with a thinker, and the annihilation of Bakunin was for Marx a preoccupation that stretched over many years. In Marx's hatred for both, in his scorn and his infinite contempt, an energy was at work that in no way can be explained by temperament and a feeling of competitiveness. Both showed him the systematic limits of his own approach, experiences that he could neither integrate nor simply disregard. Here elementary and undeniable considerations came into play, for which there was no place in Marx's plan, and for which no place has to be made. Indeed, moreover, in Stirner, as in other representatives of critical critique and of the Holy Family, Marx recognised something that was also present in himself, but whose right to exist he had to deny in order to become this Marx. With his right side, with his realistic, statesman-like, realist political and grand theoretical side, he suppressed the left, rebellious, vital, merely criticistic side, which in the others confronted him as a position as such. In his critical annihilation of Stirner and Bakunin, he stepped over his own corpse, so to speak, over the concrete existential, and in the last instance, feminine part of his intelligence. With this part he had revolted, critically and realistically concretely, against Hegel. Now he comes forward as master thinker against this side and its one-sidedness. Stirner, like Marx, belonged to the young Germany generation that, in the climate of Hegelian philosophy, with its subversive training and reflection, had developed an extraordinary sense for everything that takes place in the head. Feuerbach, Bruno Bauer, Arnold Rouge, Moses Hess, Karl Grün, Heinrich Heine, among others. Hegel's logic had conquered a space that is neither only being, nor only consciousness, but contains something of both. This is expressed in the figure of thought mediated immediacy. The magic word of the new logic is mediation, Vermittlung. We may translate it as medium. Between being and consciousness is something in the middle that is both, and in which the illusory antithesis of spirit and matter disappears. Marx transposed this vision to his theory of capital. Let us say it concretely. In people's heads, historically formed programs of thinking and perception are at work that mediate everything that moves from the outside to the inside, and vice versa. The human cognitive apparatus is, in a way, an inner relay, a switching station, a transformer in which perceptual schemata, forms of judgment, and logical structures are programmed. Concrete consciousness is never immediate, but is mediated by the inner structure. Reflection can assume basically three attitudes to this transmitted inner structure. It can try to escape the inner structure by deprogramming itself. It can move within the inner structure as clearly as possible, and it can surrender itself as reflection by accepting the thesis that the structure is everything. We now have to treat these three attitudes. Stirner's idea is simply to throw all alien programming out of one's head. After this total self-purification of the head, a naked, so to speak, empty, reflected egoism should remain. If society really has trained kinks into my head, then my emancipation, thought through quickly, must presumably consist in my dismantling this alien programming. What is one's own, and ego consciousness tries thus to rid itself with a snap of the fingers of what is alien. Stirner aims for a liberation from alienation in one's own interior. What is alien makes itself at home in me. I thus win myself back in my expelling what is alien. For several hundred pages one can read how Marx and Engels got worked up about this basically simple thought. They criticised this neo-egotistical position in a devastating way, not morally, but epistemologically, as a new self-delusion. They showed that the Stirner egos, those individuals who have based their position on nothing and view themselves as their only property, leap into a new naivety that betrays itself, not least of all in its petty bourgeois boasting standpoint of "I am the be-all and end-all." The theoretical anarchism of the 19th century reached its first culmination in Stirner. Stirner effected an existentialist reduction to pure ego, but in doing this he very naively presupposed the ego as something that simply exists. Once I have thrown out of me what is alien, society, Stirner believes, then a beautiful ego of my own remains, that revels in the possession of itself. In radiant naivety, Stirner speaks of the property that individuals have in themselves, but one can only possess what exists in reality. Here, valid reflective experience and confused naivety stand next to each other, separated by a hair's breadth. Existential reflection on one's own consciousness is as realistic as the transition to the idea of self-property is false. Self-reflection leaves nothing objective that one could possess. Marx and Engels dismantle this construction down to its atomic components. On wings of contempt, they prepare for themselves a feast of satirical reflection that, as alertly as possible, moves within the inner structure of consciousness. In the destruction of the Stirnerian illusion, however, they destroy more than the opponent. They destroy themselves in him. The way they do it, line for line, with intensive logic, meticulous philology, and a cruel pleasure in destruction that is more than critique. It is the exorcism of a danger, the elimination of another possibility. In fact, Marxism could never shake off the anarchist and existentialist shadow that fell on Stirner. Only with Sartre and Marcuse did the shadow again gain a more intensive life in Marxist-inspired thinking. Marx does not belong to that sort of naive genius that, like Schelling, develops its thoughts in public. The German ideology remained a private text. It was not published until 1932. Since then, Marx philologists have passed it around like a holy text. In the student movement, it was taken into battle as an anti-subjectivistic weapon by the strict Marxists against the spontaneists and the academic flower children. In fact, however, there was a good reason for Marx and Engels' discretion regarding their most intensive work in ideology critique. The German question lets the cat out of the bag. One can learn from it. On the question of subjectivity, Marx and Stirner went off in symmetrically false directions. Both know that human consciousness, as one initially finds it, is alienated and must be appropriated through patient reflection. Both think in the dialectic of the authentic and alien. However, both fail to find the middle ground and plunge into exclusive alternative positions. Stirner chose the right, Marx the left. Stirner believes he can overcome the expropriation of oneself, Enteignung, through the individualist act of purification. In his adulthood, individuals learn how to expel their inner alien programming so that they have it and do not have it at the same time, and thus keep it as its free masters and possessors. By surrendering thoughts and things as their own, they are no longer under their power. In Stirner's thinking, realistic self-reflection and ideological ego cult flow without clear boundaries into one another. What can be a productive experience of inner distancing from conditioning has become, in Stirnerism, dogmatically ossified to a new, short-circuited thinking. Marx's investigation of class consciousness is at its starting point equally realistic. Class consciousnesses, worldviews, and ideologies can indeed be understood as programming. They are mediations, formed and forming schemata of consciousness, results in a world historical process on the self-formation of all intellect. This way of seeing opens a path to a fruitful analysis of patterns in consciousness that can become free of the curse of naive idealism. With their, in the last instance, dogmatic materialism, however, Marx and Engels deviate from this approach again. They dissolve subjectivity in the historical process. This comes out in the harshness and contempt from which Marx treats his existential opponents. In this brutality, the other master form of reflection begins to stir. Where Stirner brought his rebellious, protesting ego out into the public arena, Marxism produced revolutionaries who, with the feeling of supreme slyness and an artful sense for reality, use themselves as means in the historical process. In the clinch with Stirner's false individual, the idea of the false nobody arises in Marx's theory. Those revolutionaries who themselves will become only grim instruments of the fetish revolution. Reader's note: the nobody in this sentence, the false nobody, is capitalized. So I assume that's a reference to the story of Odysseus again. That is the break Althusser has discerned in the Marxian oeuvre against the German ideology. Early on, at the latest, since the polemic against Stirner, there begins a tendency in Marx's thinking to chain oneself, almost like Jesuits of the Revolution, to the process of historical development, in the belief of being able not only to recognize the development, but also to direct it. Marx's theory sets its hope on domination by conceiving of the subject of the theory as a function of development. Through self-reification, it believes it can achieve a mastery of history. By making itself into the instrument of a purported future, it believes it can make the future into its own tool. This schizoid logic of Marx's cynicism has no historical parallel. Only an extremely highly developed consciousness can deceive itself in such a way. The only thinker whose self-reflection reached similar heights of artful self-denial was Friedrich Nietzsche, whose historical influence is well known. The philosophically significant pinnacle of this artful self-reification was reached by those courageous old communists who, in the Moscow show trials, in the face of certain death, falsely confessed to having conspired against the revolution, a confession that was not merely extorted, but possessed an aspect of freedom insofar as the accused, with their confessions, wanted to save the revolution from greater damage than had already been done to it by accusation and execution. The subtlety of this doubling of murder by the judiciary with suicide cannot be grasped with conventional conceptions of tragedy. They are murders in which it is clear only in the biological sense who is in fact killing whom. They are murders and suicides within a schizophrenic structure, where the ego that kills can no longer be clearly distinguished from the ego that is killed. Only one thing is certain. In the end, the corpses of intelligent human beings are lying on the ground, strangled, shot, beaten. The case of Althusser is probably, among other things, a supplement to the psychopathology of Marxism. It takes place on an intelligence level of murderous violence on which the revolution devours its cleverest children, not to mention the millions who lost their lives without knowing exactly what they had to do with this revolution, except perhaps that what was killing them could not be quite the truth. The young Marx expressed the logical root of these inversions in 1843 in a fully alert sentence that was written before the time of callousness, although it already betrayed a cynical tendency. Quoting from letters from the Deutsch Französischen Jahrbuchen, I assume that means German-French diary. Marx to Ruge, September 1843. Okay, here's the quote. Communism has seen other socialist doctrines rise up against it, not by accident, but because it itself is only a particular one-sided realization of the socialist principle. The word one-sided shows the elevated irony of Marxism at play. Those who say one-sided know that there are and must be at least two sides. Those who then decide for one side deceive themselves and others. Only a knowledge that is consumed by an enormous will to power can want to present conscious one-sidedness as the truth. In doing so, it profoundly denies its own pathos for genuine cognition. Thus, communism is that knowledge of power that tells it all before it has taken over the reins. This, and only this, constitutes on a philosophical level its affinity to fascism.